Well, it'll be a little bit nice, I think, this morning to be able to start the message by saying, take your Bibles and turn to the book of Acts. Just kidding, Jonah. You can turn to Jonah. I know. We'll put Acts in the rear view mirror, but grateful for the time that we had to study through that book and grateful for what the Lord has taught us through that. Grateful for the last several weeks, the time we had in Philippians, looking at finishing well, dying well, and last week especially. Last week, I just got to say, last week was such a joy to have Pastor George with us and to hear him preach. And then in the evening to have Alan preach. It was like the good old days. It just was a really special Sunday. I was really grateful for that. So we thought about, because a lot more people came out last week Sunday night than normally do. So, we thought about how could we just make sure that, like Alan is doing it every single week, so more people would come. So we're going to tell you that Alan may or may not be preaching this Sunday night, and you just have to come and find out. And if he doesn't, you'll be disappointed, but at least you tried. Anyway, but as we look now in this book of Jonah, I want to preface our study. This study will take several weeks, maybe a few months. We'll see how the Lord progresses with this. But I want to preface this study by saying I think there are a lot of things in Jonah that we have maybe misunderstood. And not because it is a totally different book or understanding and what we've seen or what we have been taught. But in many ways, what we have been taught about this particular book and about even Jonah himself, I think has played a little bit too much upon the way in which this story is often communicated when we're children. There are extravagant things and miraculous things that happen through this book, but there are many things in the study of this book and the way that it's presented which characterize a lot of things which we otherwise should understand as being very significant, very real, and maybe not the way that we've played it up in our minds. So the way in which this story has been depicted in pictures and other things and flannel graphs over the course of the years is maybe not quite the way that we are going to understand it and see it as we work through the course of these next few months in this particular study. There are also a couple of sort of misnomers and misconceptions about this book that will become very clear throughout the course of our study that I think we also need to clarify. As we study this book, what we are going to see is exactly what we have up on this banner here is the theme of this book. It's a balance of God's divine justice and his divine mercy. The book of Jonah is not about second chances. The book of Jonah is not even about Jonah's redemption. The book of Jonah is about the difficulty and the struggle as we view God's justice, his rightful punishment of sin, and God's mercy and his grace, and when he, in his own good pleasure and will, determines to enact it upon any group of people. And so we will wrestle through quite significantly with some of these things as we study this text together. And I pray that it will be a blessing to us, but also a challenge to us of how even Jonah in his time and others in this time and what was going on in the world scene then wrestled with some of these ideas and how very similarly we can do that today. We'll look later on about this in terms of application, but how we view God's justice and mercy as it relates to us, but also as it relates to other people. So as we begin this, we have to start with the context, and we'll start with the literary context of this particular book. Where does this book belong? We know that the book of Jonah is, in part ways, it's a prophetic book. We'll see some more characters of it here in a moment. But historically, this book belongs to what's called the Book of 12, and these would be the 12 minor prophets. And so these 12 minor prophets were written and developed sometime around 780 to about 420 or so BC, but typically from maybe the 2nd century BC onward, these books would all be found in one singular scroll, all written together, all combined really into one book. And so even in some Hebrew scriptures, there are less books of the Bible because these 12 minor prophets are all condensed and considered into just one book. But Jonah finds its way into this book of 12, and amongst these minor prophets, Called minor prophets not because what's in them is somehow less than or is not as significant as the major prophets, but called minor prophets simply just because of the length of the book. 4 chapters long, it's much smaller than something like Isaiah or Jeremiah. And we will take, after our study in Jonah, a little bit of time to look at some of these other 12, some of these other minor prophets and what they can teach us. But there are some unique features of the book of Jonah. For one, it's narrative. You find this in some other prophetic books, but it is a narrative story. We have aspects of Jonah moving from place to place. We have people groups. We have cities named. We have locations named. Very much it's a narrative. But not only that, it's also poetic. We see in Jonah chapter 2 this psalm of Jonah, a wonderful poetry section that is intertwined in the pages, which is significant and essential for how we understand the rest of the book. And then, of course, it's also prophetic. It's prophetic in the sense that it's a warning text. It's prophetic in that it follows very closely in some ways to some of the other major and minor prophets. But we see all of these elements throughout the book of Jonah. Yet it is these elements that has raised a lot of controversy for this book. Jonah is very unique in the style that it's in. The format of Jonah in terms of its introduction, the length of the book, Jonah himself as a prophet raises a lot of questions when you view it compared to other maybe more normative prophecy books, minor prophets, some of the narrative that's even included in those. Jonah really does stand apart from those things. This has led many people to look at the book of Jonah as simply being an allegory, that it's not really a true event, that there are some things that we will see throughout the course of our study in this book that it doesn't really seem like it matches up in the course of history or how it should be understood in light of other narratives or other prophetic books. But what we will see as we study is that no, this book is exactly as we should see it, to be taken historically and as reliable. All of the controversies, so to speak, and even the uniqueness of this book, and that it does seem a bit out of place in the minor prophets, is all with a purpose. And many of these things are developed in the text and through the text and are easily understood and explained when we keep this book in its historical and literary context. So Jonah is unique. It is unlike in many ways some of the other minor prophets, but it is filled with truth, challenge, encouragement, and it is a book that we will do well to study together. But we trust it to be historical and reliable, even in spite of its uniqueness and certainly in spite of its miraculous claims. As we know, the highlight or the major event in the book of Jonah is that of Jonah being swallowed by the great fish. And it seems totally unimaginable to us, something that is not possible, and has led many modern-day scholars to say, no, see, this book is just made up. It's just meant to be allegory. It's just meant to be a nice story. It's like a parable. It's not really meant to be taken literally. But we will see again that is not the case. We can trust what this says. It is the breathed-out word of God, and we will trust it in that way. This book was written most likely in around after 746 or so BC. The events of this book take place at some time around 786 to 746 BC. And there is some dispute about who is the author of this book. Some look at some of the elements of this book and say that it seems to be written at a later point in the time of Israel. It seems like maybe it was written after the exile in a post-exilic Israel, which would be after the time of Jonah. But I think what we will see again as we study through this is that the ordinary sort of easiest understanding of who the author is would be Jonah himself, relaying these events, retelling these events after he had experienced them, and hopefully after he had learned a very significant lesson in his own life. But the events are taking place sometime around that 786 to 746 BC. That's important because it leads us to our historical context. If we do not understand what is taking place in the history at this point in time in the Mediterranean world, the ancient Near East, if we do not take the historical context, we will not have an understanding of the book. If we don't get this right, much of what is in the book really won't make sense to us. We won't have a full picture of what God is trying to communicate. But there are some key verses that we can look at. Take your Bibles, if you would. Keep a finger there in Jonah, but turn back to 2 Kings chapter 14. 2 Kings chapter 14. We see in verse 23 of 2 Kings 14 that it says, "In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel, became king in Samaria and reigned 41 years." We first have to start with this understanding, is that around the time of Jonah's prophetic ministry, we have to keep in mind that Israel was split into two different kingdoms. This had taken place a few hundred years before, around 975 to 930 or so BC. Israel was split into a southern and a northern kingdom. The northern kingdom went by the name of Israel. And here in 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 23, we see that Jeroboam II is the king at the time of Jonah in northern Israel. But it's not just the northern kingdom. We also have the southern kingdom, and the southern kingdom was what was known as Judah. So you had the southern kingdom, whose capital city was Jerusalem, Judah, and you have the northern kingdom, whose capital city was Samaria, called Israel. And these two kingdoms had split because after the time of Solomon, there came another man by the name of Jeroboam, who was given a prophecy that he would be handed 10 tribes of the kingdom. Because of the various sins of Solomon and then Rehoboam, his son, and everything else, the kingdom is ultimately split. You can read much about that history in 1 Kings and see how that all plays out. But the map of Israel during that time, especially in the time of Jonah, is reflected here. In the one here on the left, you can see the two different kingdoms. You see the northern kingdom, Israel, there in red or orange, and then the southern kingdom of Judah there in the purple or pink type color. And their kingdoms were not quite as expanded as they were in the day of Jonah. When the kingdom split, they were originally very powerful, but then you have pressure which was coming from both the Syrian army, and then you also have the Assyrians, who are growing in power and gaining in power and causing all sorts of trouble, especially for the northern kingdom of Israel, but also for the southern kingdom, Judah. You have a series of pretty terrible kings that take place in especially the northern kingdom, but also in the southern kingdom. Military was weak, the finances were weak, the political scene was a mess, where you have people overthrowing one another and everything else, and the power of the Syrians was constantly diminishing the land and everything else of the northern kingdom, and the Assyrians coming right behind, growing even more powerful, seeking to dominate this whole area, this whole Mediterranean area, and would eventually do so all the way down into Egypt. But these are some of the things which are working behind the scenes at the time. Yet, in the time of Jonah, where Jeroboam II is reigning in the northern kingdom of Israel, we have a bit of a different picture. Look back at 2 Kings chapter 14, if you would. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria and reigned 41 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. He restored the territory of Israel from the entrance of Hamath to the sea of Arabah, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he had spoken through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was sent from Gath-hepher. For the Lord saw that the affliction of Israel was very bitter. Whether bond or free, there was no helper for Israel. So before Jeroboam, in the dynasty of the family of Jehu, one of these kings of the northern kingdom was falling apart. The pressure, again, from Syria and from Assyria was totally dominating the region. Weak king after weak king, and all the kings were evil. None of them turned back to the Lord. Yet, Jeroboam II comes to reign, and in his particular reign, God blesses them. And he blesses them with great financial success. He blesses them with great military conquest and success. Much of the land that had been captured and taken by Syrian powers during the time of these previous kings has been regained and recaptured under the reign of Jeroboam II. And it was the word of Jonah, as we see in 2 Kings 14, which came to Jeroboam that said this would take place, that God has given you these particular things, that God has blessed you and he is going to restore this kingdom. And so during the time of Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom was led into a time of great military, political, and financial success. In fact, it would be of special importance to Jonah because his home of Gath-Hepher was previously conquered by the Syrians. So when Jonah was a boy, a child, he in his hometown would have been most likely under Syrian control. And so for him to be able to prophesy to an Israeli king that you will have great success, you will have conquest, your land will be restored, that the politics of the day, you will reign and rule, Israel will be powerful in your reign, and the finances that are attested to in 2 Kings and Chronicles and elsewhere we read about this, they were wildly successful during this time. It would be of a special importance to Jonah because his own hometown, which was previously conquered, comes back into the kingdom of northern Israel. Clearly, Jonah has great care for his people. He has great care for this northern kingdom. And we have nothing in the text that would tell us otherwise, that Jonah would be well pleased to be the mouthpiece and the prophet of God for this northern kingdom and for this particular prophecy. We learn a lot about the times that were taking place and about the cultural landscape with Syria and Assyria and with the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom at this time. Jeroboam was successful in what he did, but we'll see something else in terms of his evil and what he didn't do, which should be noted. There's a more modern rendition of Jeroboam II, which I find to be funny. Maybe you won't, but I think this could be an accurate sort of representation. But Jeroboam II, powerful person, financial, military, conquest, everything else. But there's something that's important for us, I think we should make note of, and that's this: don't conflate blessing with godliness. Don't conflate blessing with godliness. The text here says in verse 24 about Jeroboam II, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, who had made Israel sin. Jeroboam's success has absolutely nothing to do with righteousness or godliness. Not a thing. All of the idols that were set up, all of the worship that was established, that Jeroboam, who took the northern kingdom in those 10 tribes minus Judah and the Benjamites, all of what he established and he did in setting up these high places for all this animal and idol worship was not destroyed by this whole succession of northern kings from the Jehu dynasty. Jeroboam II included in that. He had success, he had blessing, he had a prophet of God, Jonah himself, saying God is going to restore this land, he's going to give you great gain in all these things, but it's not because he's righteous. He's done evil in the sight of the Lord. He was not turning northern Israel away from worshiping these false gods and turning to idol worship. They still existed in his time. I think it's easy for us on two different levels, which we'll see, to often conflate blessing with godliness. If I do these things, God has to bless me. I deserve this blessing. Or if I am blessed, it must mean that God is looking favorably upon me. And if God is looking favorably upon me, well, I can't be doing that bad. I must be sort of godly, right? We think about this on two different spheres. The first one is nationally. And this would definitely be the case in the time of Jonah and under the reign of Jeroboam II. It seems definitely Israel is being blessed. Land is expanding. Power is doing well. Stock market is up in that time. God must be blessing this wonderful nation who has turned their hearts back to him in full obedience. That's not the case. They are just as evil. They are just as wicked. Yet God, in his own grace and his own mercy, decides to bless. He is working his own purpose. He even here says that he has not said he would no longer see Israel, that he would blot Israel out from under heaven. He's turning in grace towards a people he has called to himself despite their evil and their sins. I don't think I have to speak much about the parallels that we can find in this today. We have to be very careful to not conflate blessing with godliness on a national level. I don't care who is in the Oval Office. The United States of America is not a godly nation. We have turned far from the Lord. And any blessing and grace that God gives to us and imparts on us is simply that, his grace toward us. It is not necessarily because we have somehow turned in great godliness towards him. In fact, and I think in many ways, unfortunately, it's a growing time of those who think they are godly and are truly not, and are far from him. We have to be very careful of that. Secondly, how does this look personally? Again, very health and wealth, gospel sort of orientated. If I have my health, if I have financial success, if I have blessing, God must be looking favorably upon me. But that is oftentimes not the case. Look at the history and the testimony. I often think of the apostles. They would be the worst health and wealth, prosperity gospel preachers, sacrificing their lives, dying, in prison, everything else for the sake of the gospel. Where is their blessing? Something about our reward being in heaven, I think, right? We have to be very careful about how we conflate blessing with godliness in our own lives. Let me tell you something. Sometimes God is gracious just because God is gracious. That is indeed the definition of grace. It's not something earned. It's not something deserved. God is just oftentimes gracious. And we are the beneficiaries of it nationally and personally. In the time of Jonah, under the reign of Jeroboam II, that is obviously here the case. But I want to paint the scene. Go back to Jonah, if you would, Jonah chapter 1. We have to have this in our minds as we look into the text now of Jonah, of what it is that Jonah may have been feeling. Success is coming to his homeland. His hometown, which was under oppression and control of an Armenian army, a Syrian army, is now being given back to Israel. He has been the mouthpiece of God for that. He has seen this kingdom grow, and he has seen its finances continue, and he has seen all of the enemies that they so hate, the Syrians and the Assyrians, at this particular time in their history, become weakened for this short window. And he is the mouthpiece of God for this under Jeroboam. What a blessing it must be for him to have such wonderful news for his people. And now we look at Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." Jonah's prophetic ministry is about to take a drastic turn to a Gentile people, the Ninevites. No longer now is God asking Jonah to prophesy to his people, to Israel in this northern kingdom, these 10 tribes. But now the word of the Lord has come. Get up, arise, an imperative, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it. We know a little bit about the Ninevites, especially as you look into Assyrian history and culture and everything else. Here's a depiction of the city of Nineveh. I will say that this picture here, which is often associated with Nineveh, would be after the time of Jonah. It wasn't until Sennacherib became king of Assyria that he moved the capital of Assyria to Nineveh. Typically, when we think about Nineveh, we always think capital of Assyria, if you have some familiarity and understanding with it. It was not the capital of Assyria during the time of Jonah. So it did become later. It was still a great city, an important city, but it did not become its capital until Sennacherib, who is a little bit later than the time of Jonah. But this is a picture of its heyday during the time of Sennacherib. The palace of Sennacherib is depicted there, but it was a metropolis. It was not only large in its size, but it was great. It was expansive. It was majestic even. It was a well-known, well-developed, powerful city. And that would become the capital of the Assyrian Empire and all their growing power and everything else. But Jonah again is now sent to go here, to Nineveh, to a Gentile people. And it's important for us to know that this is unprecedented. Any other prophet. God has told prophets that he would use Gentile nations to punish Israel. God has told prophets that he would bless Israel or punish Israel in different ways, and how other nations would rise and come to power in the midst of various things. But never had God told a prophet to go to a Gentile nation to only cry out against that particular nation with, here, no relation to anything going on in Israel. Jeroboam II has just taken the northern kingdom and he's moved it and reclaimed all of these different lands. He's pushed the Assyrians back and their dominant power back. The Syrian army is barely holding on. And now the word comes to Jonah, arise, go to Nineveh, and cry out against it. And Jonah is probably thinking, why on earth would I want to go there? Why on earth would you send me there? I am the prophet for Jeroboam. I am the prophet and the mouthpiece of God for the northern kingdom, and look how you have greatly blessed us. But now, get up, go to Nineveh. The imperative that's used here, arise, go, and then the further one, cry out against it, denotes both judgment and warning. It's a very common usage, a common verb that is used throughout many of the minor prophets and major prophets. Jonah, as prophet, would be commanded not only to judge this nation, to let them know that there is punishment and consequence coming, but he would also be there to warn them of these things. We have to keep this in mind. This is very, very important. But the idea of warning constitutes God's grace. If a prophet is going to go somewhere to judge them and proclaim God's judgment because of their sins and iniquity or anything else, it always comes with a sense that they would have an opportunity to turn from their sin and to not experience the judgment that is coming upon them. So it plays the role, yes, of judgment, but it also plays the role of warning. That Jonah is sent to declare that message, but to warn this Gentile people who had just been in and around his homeland, oppressing his kingdom, that judgment is on its way, but grace could still be had. This precipitates the action that we see in verse 3. But Jonah arose to flee. I think it'd be helpful for us at this point to try to understand a little bit more why Jonah has such a problem with the Ninevites. What is it about these Assyrians who, at this point in time, again, have been very weakened in their kingdom, but even just another 100 years less later, are going to establish their dominance all through Israel. Well, here are some well-attested to historical records of the Ninevites and the Assyrians throughout various reigns of kings that came just before the time of Jonah, and the time that they were building their dominance and everything else and oppressing the Syrian people and trying to push even further into the lands of Israel. It's well attested to in the historical record and wall paintings and archaeology and many other things, but listen to some of these decrees and some of these sayings of the kings of Assyria just before the time of Jonah. One writes this about: the nobles and elders of the city come out to me to save their lives. They seized my feet and said, if it pleases you, kill. If it pleases you, spare. If it pleases you, do what you will. Another inscription about their military conquest says, I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me. I draped their skins over the pile, and I spread out within the pile. Some I erected on stakes upon the pile. I flayed many right through my land, draped their skins over the walls. Another says, I felled 50 of their fighting men with the sword, burnt 200 captives from them, defeated in a battle on the plain of 32 troops. With their blood, I dyed the mountains red like red wool. The rest of them, the ravines and the torrents of the mountains swallowed. I carried off captives and possessions from them. I cut off the heads of their fighters and built there a tower before the city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls. In strife and conflict, I besieged and conquered the city. I felled 3,000 of their fighting men with the sword. I captured many troops alive. I cut off some of their arms and hands. I cut off others, their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of the living and one of heads. I hung their heads on trees around the city. This was the military dominance, violence of the Assyrian people in the time of Jonah. They were so bent on taking over, and they would do so in the most grotesque and gruesome ways. This is well attested to in their own historical records. It would be a prize for a king to write these things. Look how we've decimated a foreign people in view of our dominance. This is the people that was oppressing the Syrians. This was a people that was trying to infiltrate into a homeland that was already torn apart in a divided kingdom of Israel. Jonah's own hometown, threatened by this growing Assyrian power. And Jonah had the opportunity to prophesy against them. The northern kingdom will be blessed. It will have its land. It will push back these evil forces who are against God. And then here, sometime after, the word of the Lord comes to Jonah. Go to Nineveh, that great city. Cry out against it, for their wickedness, much of what was read, has come up before me. But Jonah recognizes that this, yes, would be a call to judgment, but what God is offering to this particular people is also grace, that they could be saved from the judgment to come. So Jonah responds in verse 3. He arises, which we may begin to think, oh, he's obeying. Same word that's used, the imperative, arise, go. Jonah does just that. But he does so not to go to Nineveh, but he does so to flee. I think for us there is an important application for us to take out of this, which really will be the theme of the book as a whole, and something that for us as we work through this need to wrestle with some of the own tension we may have in this area. But we must accept God's grace for all people, especially those we find unworthy. I say this almost in a sense that makes it seem like God needs us to accept his grace on some merit that only if we accept it is it effective. But that's just not the case. God is going to be gracious to whom he is going to be gracious to. And by saying that we have to accept God's grace for all people, what I don't mean is some sort of universal sense of salvation. I mean that we have to accept that upon those who God is going to be gracious and demonstrates his grace, we have to fall into submission to that. We've said this before, but it will continue to be a difficult thing and for our own hearts and minds and lives to grow in this particular area. But there are many people, I think, that we have a hard time looking at and saying, man, I really hope they get saved. Or I really hope they become, folded into the church. I really hope they understand the truth of God's grace and his wonder and everything else. There are probably some in our own lives and even some on a national level that we look at and we say, they're just not worthy of this grace. Jonah was doing that to Nineveh. They're just not worthy of this grace. If he had thought they were, he would have arisen and gone to Nineveh. But he doesn't. He arises and he flees. There's no way that this people is deserving of that. But how quickly Jonah forgot his own history. God blessed the kingdom of Jeroboam II, gave it great military, political, financial success. Why? Because they were righteous. Because God was gracious. Jeroboam was evil, and God still blessed. Nineveh, wicked and evil, yet God is still going to offer them his grace and to use Jonah as the means to bring it. Turn to Ephesians chapter 2, if you would. As we think about the communion table, preparing our hearts to receive and remember what Christ has done for us, it comes with us this idea of remembrance that we would not soon forget how we stand and how we stood before a holy God. Ephesians 2, verse 1. And you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of the world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom we also once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. For by grace you have been saved, raised us up together, made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace and his kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. A familiar text to us, no doubt, but one that bears a great reminder for us. Lest we, like Jonah, personally, nationally, or anything else, look at those around us and say, I just don't really think they're going to grasp God's grace. I just don't know if they're worthy of God's grace. Look how sinful they are. Look how wicked they are. Look at all these things. There's no way that God could ever save them. We at that point take God's salvation and God's grace and we make it work-based. We make it merit-based. We make it based on our own opinion and it's subject to us. Foolish if we do that. Because who are we before a holy God dead in trespasses and sin, yet he made us alive. Because of our good works, because we've been righteous, because we were worthy to be saved. Foolish again. Because of his grace. We are dead in trespasses and sin, not worthy of anything other than hell. And God, in his grace and mercy, looked upon us and said, the work of my Son Christ on the cross is effective for you. So lest we deprive others of that same grace, may we not forget that we ourselves were once unworthy, dead in trespasses and sin, boasting in our own works which only gain us hell, and fully reliant on the grace of Christ. We will see and be challenged with this throughout the book and study of Jonah. We will see it all the more as Jonah moves away from and into Nineveh, and these themes will continue to permeate our study throughout this book. But I pray that for us it would be a continual evaluation of our own hearts and our own lives. How do I view and perceive those who are around me? How do I view and perceive my own standing before God? And may he challenge us in some of these areas. I invite you to stand, if you would. We're going to sing hymn 312 as we transition to our communion service. And again, I think this is a great time for us, recognizing this grace, to remember it through taking the representation, the symbol of the body and the blood of Christ. That is the evidence of God's grace to us. It is through Christ that we have that, and it is important for us to remember and practice it. But let's sing this together as we prepare our hearts and minds. Hymn 312, Calvary covers it all. Thank you. You may be seated.